And joining us now here in studio, Dave Toycen, President and CEO of World Vision Canada. Dave, it's always a pleasure to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Steve.
There is a food crisis happening and a water crisis happening in West Africa's Sahel region. We're going to bring a map up here and we'll show people the countries in question that have been affected here. We're talking in the west, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad, also parts of Nigeria, Cameroon, Burkina Faso. You recently returned, I gather, within the past couple of weeks from a visit to this part of the world. And start by telling us what conditions were like on the ground from what you saw.
Well, I think maybe I'll just start with a story. I was talking to a mother. She had 2 children, married, and we were talking about this situation. She was deeply concerned about the food. And so I asked her, I said, what do you do? What are you feeding your children to?
Which country are you in?
This is
now?
in Mali.
In Mali, okay.
In West Africa. And she said, well, I cook a porridge, that's all we have now, and I feed the children first, then my husband, then myself. And then she said, if there's a little bit left over, I'll try and give the children a little bit later at night. And then she looked down at her tummy, because she was pregnant, and she said, but the child inside my belly cannot cry out.
Oh.
And she was basically saying, I'm worried about the health of my unborn child. And that was typical of the concern we saw in virtually every family. We'd look at their grain bins. They have their about maybe 12 feet high, maybe 5-6 feet wide in diameter. You'd look in and there'd be just this much, and they're not going to get a harvest until September or October.
The food that she does have, where did she get it from?
Well, it's basically, it was millet, a common grain that they grow, so they had a little bit of that left. And then they used the leaves of the baobab tree, which many people associate with Africa. They grind the leaves up. They're very high in vitamin C. This has been part of their learning as they've been part of our community development over the last years. And so they have that. And then the other thing they've been doing that's making quite a bit of difference is we've been encouraging vegetable gardens, hand-watered vegetable gardens, because it's both providing a food source, but it's also expanding the diet. And it's especially important for children because they're getting much more vitamins, and it's simply healthier for them. So actually, I was encouraged in the sense that I expected to see worse conditions than I actually did, when you consider how low their food supply is at this point.
How many times a day would that family that you met eat?
Oh, they're eating once a day, and then if there's a little left over, they might have half a meal at least for the children. That seemed to be fairly average for most family.
So that porridge, once a day, is what they've got to live on.
That's right. And if they're fortunate, this family had planted a few vegetables, so it appeared to me they could augment with vegetables once in a while.
Do you have any reason to believe that their experience is not indicative of everybody's experience there right now?
Well, I don't think it's everybody.
Not everybody, but you know what I'm
in
saying.
many of the, we were in rural villages, and these are people that are making $1.50 a day, just in good times.
How many people would you estimate then are at risk?
Well, overall, the number that'll be impacted is something like 20 million people across those countries, and it's about 13 million people that are really in need of food.
Tell me, I want to make sure that, as you pointed out, it wasn't what you necessarily thought, so let's be really clear about this. 13 million people in need of food. Does that mean they're starving to death as we speak?
No, there's certainly some children who are getting severely malnourished, but I didn't see starvation yet. And the way I would describe it, Steve, is that I think we have 2 choices here. One choice is that we wait until things get much worse. Starving children, images, skeletal babies, and then the world will respond. People always respond. But the tragedy of that is many children will have already died, and then you've got the trauma that creates in society, and plus it's more expensive. Because when you're feeding starving children, you have to have a different kind of food, therapeutic feeding. The second option, of course, this is what we believe is critical, is do something now.
Why wait?
Why wait? And avoid those images, and we won't have, and at the same time, we're going to be able to continue, even some of the development work that we're doing now won't get stopped in the same way either. So those are the choices, I think.
What do you think is responsible for this most recent food crisis?
It's really a combination of 3 things. The most obvious is drought. They actually had drought in 2010, so just were recovering from that, and then got short rains in 2011. And these are rural people who live crop to crop. The second piece is just the crisis in cost for food. I talked to numerous families, things like rice, millet. They're paying up to 100% more than they did a year ago. And these are families, many of them, 80% of their normal income goes to food. So when you see prices jacked like that, that's a terrible situation for them. And then lastly, these are poor people. This is endemic poverty, so their level of resilience is very low.
How much of this can you point to governments not caring, or governments being unable to, or disputes among differing, all of that kind of stuff? Does that play a role?
Well, yes. I mean, first, I suppose it's better to look at ourselves. I don't think we're providing enough development support for these countries to do the development that they need. But it's obvious their governments, they need to be more effective in what they're doing to things. And there's issues around corruption, for example, and just overall efficiency. I mean, the good news at this point is the government there, at least in Mali, that's where I was visiting, my understanding was, in talking with our staff who deal with them every day, that they're trying to do something. They've made commitment to feed about 17,000 people in this one area. So there's a start. But much more is needed. And then you've got all kinds of infrastructure problems, high levels of illiteracy. You know, when you start looking at the scope, and it's never just one thing.
All adds up.
But that's what you have to tackle. You have to keep tackling those things at a consistent basis year after year after year.
People may ask, how can it be 13, how do you get to 13 million people? Well, we're going to show you, if we can. Let's bring this graphic up right now, which shows country by country in the area, all of the children in particular that are dealing with malnutrition, starting in the country of Chad, where there is severe malnutrition for almost 130,000 children, acute malnutrition for almost 75,000. How about Nigeria? In the northern regions alone, more than 200,000 people with severe malnutrition, more than 500,000 kids with acute malnutrition. In Mali, where Dave just came back from, 175,000 with severe, 270,000 plus with acute. In Niger, more than 330,000 people, children suffering severe malnutrition, and more than 300,000 with acute malnutrition. Burkina Faso, almost 100,000, more than 250,000. And in Cameroon, in the northern regions, just over 55,000 and almost 100,000. The World Health Organization, I don't have to tell you, cites malnutrition as one of the greatest single threats to the world's public health. You look at those numbers, what do those numbers mean to you?
Well, it just means that there's a whole lot of communities where they're not able to look after their children right now. And I guess the other side of it is we know this can be defeated, that it can be managed.
Those are two different things. Are you saying defeated or managed?
Well, I'm saying managed, but eventually defeated. These are, most of the situations that these children are in are things that we can deal with. It's simply a matter, in many cases, of getting better nutrition. One of the things we do at World Vision, we have a program where we introduce to the mothers a whole range of vegetables that they haven't necessarily used before. They can grow themselves, and teaching them to weigh their children and measure them weight for height, so they're monitoring. Once they have a card, and if the child goes below the green line, then there's a yellow line, there's a red line, that tells them they have to seek help. All these kind of interventions that actually deal with nutrition and simple things. Clean water, for example. One of the priorities, clean water in a community will usually reduce the death, mortality of children under 5 by almost 50%. So these are all things we can do. Now, obviously, the challenge is it has to come from inside the country. Otherwise, we're really doing Band-Aid work. It's saving people's lives, but how are we making it sustainable? And of course, that's the biggest challenge. We've been working there for 20 years. We see progress. Is it enough? No. But we're not going to be discouraged.
This is Water Week on TVO, so I want to follow up with another question on water. The Niger River, West Africa's principal river, running through Niger, Nigeria, and Mali. Can you give us some idea of the water problems associated with that right now?
Well, I think one of the issues around it is just there's tremendous potential for irrigation that's simply not being done because there hasn't been the investment to do that. And also, I would have to say, you have to remember the river is helpful for a certain area, but it's still about rainfall. And so when you get drought, unless you have a fairly sophisticated system of water supply from the river across the countryside, you're still going to face major troubles. But there's no question with irrigation, the level of crop production could be increased, well, exponentially in terms of where it is right now.
Whose responsibility is it to get that land irrigated?
Well, I think ultimately it's the government. And
Which government?
The government of Mali, in this case. They have to show leadership in that area. And of course, there has to be a willingness, generally from outsiders, to be prepared to invest in that. Obviously, much of it is commercial, and so, but if you don't have good governance, if you don't have a strong enough commitment from the government itself in the local country, people are not going to invest. And so it's oftentimes that tension between the possibility, but then the reluctance because there isn't the right infrastructure in place.
The aid organization Oxfam has said tens of thousands are dying in the Sahel region due to, quote, international complacency. You agree with that statement?
Yes, I do. I do, because we have it within our ability, without huge sacrifices anywhere, to provide. I think the UN is estimating somewhere in the neighborhood of, they're looking for $700 million of commitments from countries around the world. Canada's given 41 million, which I think is a good start. And some other countries have pitched in, but we're still way below the amount of money that needs to be pledged, so that particularly the World Food Program, for example, can go out and either purchase or receive the food from Western countries so that it can be distributed.
If you think, as Oxfam does as well, that the world is internationally complacent about this place, how would you propose to get the world internationally uncomplacent about this place?
Yeah, great question, great question. I mean, first of all, we have to be creative and think of ways in which to tell the story and to bring a focus and attention on this. And it's easy to say that's what needs to be done. It's a lot harder to do it. And I mean, for example, just within World Vision, we have regular supporters. About 30,000 people from Canada would be supporting sponsored children in those countries, in Mali rather. And so that's one area that we go within our private support. But we're not big enough to be able to provide support for a whole country, for example. So I just encourage people, that's one thing that can be done. But then we still have to rely on governments from the outside, like Canada, to come in and pledge and help. And we have to be, I think as aid agencies, we just have to try to be more creative in terms of how we tell the story. How do we get the public's attention? That's the challenge, I think, and it's difficult. Social media, on the one hand, I think gives us some more opportunities, but how do you get, you know, in a kind of soundbite world, you know that well, you struggle with the same thing here, I'm sure, is how do we get people's attention long enough to actually hear not just the problem, but in fact there are solutions.
Well, we know it's possible because a month ago, nobody heard of Coney.
That's right.
And now 100 million people know about Coney 2012.
Right. Yeah,
They've seen it on YouTube.
Yeah.
So lightning can strike in a positive way.
Absolutely. And I think what they've done at the level of just awareness is a challenge to all of us doing this kind of work. I don't think we're being creative enough. And I hope that out of that, we'll spin some new ideas as to how to do this more effectively.
Here's Jeffrey York writing in the Globe and Mail a few weeks ago. Talk to veteran aid workers and they'll admit that one of their biggest challenges in the vast drought-stricken Sahel region is simply the task of collecting reliable information. People here in this impoverished, semi-arid region of West Africa are highly mobile and largely illiterate. Borders are porous, roads are poor, cultures are traditional, and the government presence is minimal. To respond to a humanitarian emergency, you need good statistics, but how to gather them? Would you agree? Is that a problem?
Oh, yes, I do think it's an issue, absolutely. And we could be more efficient, and we could probably be even more on top of the situations if we had all those statistics. But I still believe we know enough to be able to respond. And obviously I'm reflecting, you know, our World Vision experience where we've been working in these communities for 20 years in some cases. So we know who's there. We have a pretty good idea of who needs help, but that's just certain parts of the country where we work.
Well, let's pick this apart a little bit. Porous borders. How does that present a challenge for people who are trying to do what you're doing?
Well, it just means if there's any kind of conflict. For example, in northern Mali right now, there's been some conflict going on between a tribal group and the government, and about, I think it's over 200,000 people have fled the area because they're afraid for safety, and they've gone into neighboring Chad, I believe it is, for protection.
Crumbling infrastructure or no infrastructure, how does that present a challenge?
Well, when you get out in the countryside, you just don't have roads that are that good to be able to deliver even emergency food, and that makes it more complicated.
Cultural issues?
Yes, just issues I think the nutrition is just one example where how do you help introduce foods that can be grown there that aren't normal to the culture and they can understand that it's good for their babies. And of course the mothers are critical in that. That's changing, but that continues to be a problem. Sometimes there can be practices in the culture that For example, where girls are disempowered. And the mothers and the girls especially are so critical to the future of the health of children.
Government presence. When you are there, do you see any sign of a government providing public services to people?
I didn't on this trip, but we did have a good interview with the local prefet, the local district leader, and he was clearly upset about this and was doing what he thought he could do to help. So, but in terms of the actual villages themselves, it's minimal. There's a school, there were schools in every place, so there was a government-funded teacher or teachers. So that service was there, but in terms of what we'd be accustomed to in Canada, no, you wouldn't find it.
When you were in Mali, how far away from the capital city would you have been when you were visiting one of those remote villages?
We were about 5 hours.
5 hours drive?
Yeah, 5 hours drive.
And not exactly on the 401?
No.
So a long way.
Yeah, a long way.
And therefore difficult for a government that even maybe wanted to provide services to get to.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the whole issue of infrastructure. Yet I have to say, when I think my first trip to Mali was 20 or 25 years ago. In the capital city, I hardly recognized it in terms of some of the changes that have gone on there. But getting those changes, the modern roads and all that sort of thing, getting that out into the countryside is another issue.
Okay, I should know this, but I don't. What's the capital of Mali?
It's Bamako.
And you had noticed a huge change in terms of positive developments over 25 years.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's still, there's still poverty in parts of the city, but in terms of
infrastructure,
new buildings, some lovely roads, and yet once you get off that, then a lot of it hasn't changed.
How about, would you have visited 25 years ago some of the remote villages that you now find yourself in, and could you gauge the kind of change you saw over those 25 years in rural Mali?
Unfortunately, I'd have to say we were working further north back in those days, but I can tell, I was talking with the chief in one of the villages that I visited, and I said the question to him, I said, World Vision's been here, what difference has it made? You're in the middle of a drought, you're struggling with food, and he looked at me, he said, well, our children are in school, we have clean water in our community, our kids are healthier, they're getting health care. And then he looked at me and he said, and I have people trained in this village, they know what to do with these facilities that we have. So there's still progress.
Dave, I'm always tempted to finish our conversations by asking a religious question to a guy who runs a religious organization. So in our last 30 seconds, let me try this. When you're on your most recent trip to Mali, do you pray when you're over there?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's certainly a practice of mine, and even with our staff, we have staff who are Christian, but we also have staff who aren't. So those who are comfortable, most people are, and we'll usually have a prayer at the beginning of the day to start us off.
And what do you pray for?
Well, we pray for, first of all, for wisdom. We pray for protection, because the roads are always more dangerous in these places. And you pray that the local people will receive the support, not just from us at World Vision, but from their government, from other places in the world. You're basically asking, how can we be part of delivering hope? That's what we're about.
Those sounds like good things to pray for. Thank you very much for coming into TVO tonight, as always. Dave Toycen from World Vision Canada.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.